My name is Michael Reisinger. This is my project for English 103, and it deals with the video game Battlefield 1, which came out in October 2016. Battlefield 1 takes place during World War I, which is why they put the 1 in the title. And it's been praised for its stunning visuals, its tight controls, all that jazz. And it currently sits at an 87 on Metacritic, which is a really good score. And to say it's been well received is a little bit of an understatement. However, despite how good of a game it seems to be, it is still indicative of how the recent genre of first-person shooters seems to glorify and desensitize us to war. And this could lead to like a greater sense of eagerness for war, similar to how in World War I, like when Battlefield 1 takes place, how people during that time were really eager for war and kind of jumping over each other to get into a war. This isn't to say that I think violent video games cause violent behavior. I don't. Any study that has searched for a connection between aggressive behavior and aggressive video games has turned up nothing, so it'd be kind of foolish to argue that. But what I am arguing is that violent video games like Battlefield 1 desensitize us to war, not violence. The difference between those two is that desensitization towards violence is just violence in general, like violence towards animals, everything. Whereas desensitization to war is basically being desensitized to killing an enemy. And that is accomplished in all wars and in Battlefield 1 through the process of dehumanization. This dehumanization can be seen everywhere in all conflicts. A really good example of this is in both world wars, how they use propaganda to dehumanize the enemy. And there have been some studies that go into how dehumanization works. And this is also something that pop culture has picked up on, as in the 2014 movie Fury. In this movie, there's a scene in which Sergeant Collier and a group of soldiers cluster around a lone, unarmed Nazi trooper. And Collier orders one of his green subordinates, Gunner Ellison, to shoot the man. The Nazi then starts to plead for his life and show pictures of his wife and children. And as a result, Ellison refuses to shoot, however, Collier forces him to do so. This is pretty bad. Like, you don't just shoot an unarmed man pleading for his life. But Collier had been desensitized to war, and through this dehumanization process, didn't see the Nazi as a human anymore. Not to say that Nazis are good people, particularly, but you still shouldn't just kill them in cold blood, as that isn't really okay in modern society. And so, Battlefield 1 also dehumanizes the enemy, despite it being in a different world war, and it does this dehumanization through the adversaries that you fight in the game. This takes place in both major game modes, these being the single-player War Stories mode and the multiplayer mode. So firstly, in regards to War Stories, this War Stories focuses on 7 distinct experiences exploring the exploits of multiple Allied fighters in World War I. Most of these War Stories are pretty standard fare within the sphere of first-person shooters, with point A, point B, shoot a bunch of guys. With one major exception being the first experience called Storm of Steel, in which the player joins the ranks of the Harlem Hellfighters, a black infantry unit. And you basically jump into the body of a random soldier, and then when that random soldier is killed, you jump into a different body, and this repeats forever until a certain time limit hits and then the game ends. And what's unique about this is that when you die, a random name pops up, a birth date, and a death date flashes on the screen. And you're killing Germans all the while. At first glance, this kind of desensitizes players to just violence in general, as you wouldn't really care if your guy died and didn't have a name. But since your guy has a name and an age, that kind of creates a sense of empathy. Like, you get sad because the dead man had a name, he was cut down into the prime. So you're basically sensitive to the violence on the Harlem Hellfighters side, but you've been killing faceless Nazis all day, and you haven't really given a shit. So, like, they're no longer human, basically. They're just a program, and you're just mowing them down. But the Harlem Hellfighters have some sense of personification, which makes them more real. So you're basically desensitized to the enemy and not towards the friendly people. Also, just one more thing I'd like to add. There's been a recent study in which they can link the fact that a first-person shooter has a story with how invested a player is in the characters. So if a first-person shooter has a story, the player is more likely to get invested, which means they will more likely care about the people involved and not the enemies. So they'll care more about the people and less about the enemies, basically. So further dehumanizing the enemies and further humanizing the protagonists. Now we're moving on to multiplayer. This is probably the greater contributor to dehumanization, and it does this in two main ways. The first one being an immersion into the experience. It has the combination of the first-person camera and incredibly realistic graphics kind of makes the player immersed in the experience. Not to the degree in which fantasy is indistinguishable from reality, but rather when you kill someone, it's called a kill and not like a point or something else other than kill. Like you're killing someone, basically, quote unquote killing. And the second reason is kind of an opposite of the first, and it's actually the graphical limitations of Battlefield 1. And that being that there's only 4 classes, basically 4 meshes. And so these meshes, everybody looks the same. And it's easier to dehumanize a group of people if they all look the same, if they're all clones of each other. They're basically faceless. They don't have personality, which makes it easier to see them as mindless drones rather than people. Battlefield 1 isn't like the only cause of this, though. It's just kind of like the genre overall has aspects and tropes that aid in this desensitization process. Neurologically speaking, the part of the brain that deals with pleasure is always active when you're playing a first-person shooter. So playing games are fun. But when you're killed by an enemy, activity in that part of the brain decreases. Essentially, it's bad that you got killed by the enemy. Like, you don't get fun anymore. It's just kind of sucks, which makes a lot of sense. And you basically associate that negative feeling with the enemy player that killed you, and this association would cause the player to further dehumanize the opponent, leading to an increase in desensitization to war through dehumanization of the enemy. So I didn't just mention desensitization, I also mentioned glorification. The game does this not purposely, but to meet the demands of the players. Battlefield 1 is the latest installment in the Battlefield franchise, but in the first week, it outsold the previous 2 installations combined of their first weeks. So why did it do this? A possible reason is the setting. Both Battlefield 4 and Battlefield Hardline took place in the modern day, which seems a little too real, a little too close to home, whereas Battlefield 1 takes place in World War I, something that happened over 100 years ago. There are mythological figures associated with World War I now, like Lawrence of Arabia and Winston Churchill. Like, stuff like that. Like, there are battles that seem fictitious now, almost. And so this kind of contributes to this glorification of war, because we're seeing all these glorified figures duking it out, basically, and we get to take part in these battles and help win. And so that sense of victory also causes a sense of glorification, because we associate that sense of victory with war itself. So more specifically into multiplayer, how multiplayer glorifies war. There's a system that does this. It's called the medals and ribbons system. They're kind of like accolades that you can get for doing certain things, like healing a certain amount of people or killing a certain amount of people with a certain gun. And this is that's kind of a reward. So it releases the reward chemical, dopamine, in the brain. This dopamine release is registered as pleasure, basically, which the player then associates with the medals and ribbons, and by proxy, the deeds of war done to get those medals. This furthers the association of glory and war, thereby glorifying war. To reiterate, this desensitization to war and glorification of it could possibly make the populace more susceptible to war. Basically meaning that they'll be more eager to go to war because they don't see the enemy, or their possible enemy, as people. They're more excited to go do it because they associate good things with war. rather than bad things. So that's my argument. Battlefield 1 desensitizes us to and glorifies war. That's what I think. If you think otherwise, tell me in the comments below, or don't. I don't really care.